Yes, David Taylor to Oklahoma State is bad news for Penn State wrestling.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Now, before this episode begins, I do need to preface that this conversation was recorded ahead of the official announcement by Oklahoma State that David Taylor was going to be its next head coach. But all the information, the entire discussion is still relevant even with the breaking news. Enjoy. If David Taylor does take the job at Oklahoma State, I've been told that it's very good for the sport of wrestling. This is Locked On Nittany Lions. I'm your host, Zach Seyko, and thanks so much for making us your first listen and watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. And back from NittanySportsNow.com, that is Joe Smeltzer, beat reporter for Penn State football, Penn State men's basketball, and Penn State wrestling. You can keep up with him on X. Joe, David Taylor to Oklahoma State seemed almost like a dream. It didn't seem real. It didn't seem like reality. And then things keep progressing towards the two sides coming to an agreement. Again, things could change, I guess, at the time of this when this episode goes up early Tuesday here. But it seems like David Taylor to Oklahoma State could legitimately happen. If it does happen, I can't say if and when because it seems really 50-50. If it does happen, David Taylor to Oklahoma State is bad for Penn State wrestling. That's just the honest truth. Because if you take David Taylor, who's a staple in the Nittany Lion Wrestling Club, trains other wrestlers up in the Pennsylvania area, right? David Taylor is an anchor in what Penn State wrestling has been for the past decade, right? He is an extension of that. And you take him out of state college, you take him away from Penn State and drop him in Oklahoma State. That is the first of a long list of reasons why it would be bad for Penn State wrestling, the program and the culture.
Yeah, Zach, and thanks as always for having me on. You think about how kind of intertwined David Taylor is with Cael Sanderson, right? Going back to when David was wrestling in high school, he wanted to follow Cael Sanderson anywhere. If Cael didn't leave Iowa State to go to Penn State, David Taylor would be an Iowa State wrestling legend and not a Penn State wrestling legend. But obviously, we all know the story. Cael goes to Penn State, DT goes with him. And from there, DT kind of followed what Cael had done in both folk style and freestyle wrestling. In folk style, I don't know if anybody's ever going to match what Cael Sanderson did at Iowa State in folk style, but DT won 2 Hodge trophies and 2 national championships, so he did quite well for himself. And then in freestyle, Zach, if you actually look at the numbers, David Taylor exceeded what Cael Sanderson accomplished in freestyle, and a lot of that is due to after Cael won the gold medal, he kind of moved on from freestyle more or less and went into coaching. But David won 3 world championships and an Olympic gold medal. Cael has the Olympic gold medal. And we kind of, it was probably pretty easy to guess, right, that David Taylor would one day get into coaching. He's already kind of doing it. He has his own training center, works with NLWC, has trained a bunch of guys such as Levi Haynes and, of course, the guy that ended up beating him, Aaron Brooks. But this soon, we're talking a few weeks after the Olympic trials, where up until he wrestled Aaron Brooks, many people still looked at David Taylor as maybe the best wrestler in the world at 86 kilograms. And now it's definitely a fluid thing, and wrestling's not like other sports where you need to have years on a coaching staff, need to be a head coach somewhere, need to be whatever, wrestling, guys kind of get into it. Not really, I wouldn't want to say right away because David Taylor does have experience in training, but if you're an all-time great wrestler, which David Taylor is, that kind of betters your chances of being a great coach. We look all over. Cael Sanderson, obviously. Dan Gable, obviously. Tom Brand's Olympic gold medalist. The guy that David Taylor would be succeeding should he take this job. John Smith at Oklahoma State, 2-time Olympic gold medalist. So, it's David Taylor has all the ingredients, I think, to be a great head coach. He definitely interviews well. I know that just from spending 20 minutes with him before the Olympic trials. And that was when he had really nothing to gain just talking to the press. But now when he has something to gain in a job interview, I can only imagine how impressive he is in that department. But I think it was pretty easy to guess that David Taylor would one day go into coaching. I don't think we would have expected it to happen so soon, but it looks like that's definitely at least a possibility. It seems that the top two guys for the job are David Taylor and Coleman Scott, who was John Smith's associate head coach at Oklahoma State. And Coleman Scott is a wrestling great in his own right. He won the national championship for his future boss at Oklahoma State. He was a medalist at the 2012 Olympic Games in London, and also a native of Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, which is where I went to college. But it sounds like it's going to be one of those two guys. And I think even if DT doesn't get the job, if it goes to Coleman Scott, that could make for a pretty interesting dynamic in college wrestling too, because he's still a young guy, 38 years old. David Taylor's 33 years old, and kind of similar to David Taylor, not quite as accomplished in the wrestling world, but an Olympic medalist and a Pan American champion and a national champion in full style. That's a pretty good resume itself. So I think whatever Oklahoma State decides to do, that's going to lead to some pretty good years for what's already a perennial top five program in the country. So.
Yeah, I just don't. I really don't like the idea. This is, I guess, a bit selfish as a Penn State Nittany Lions show here. But taking David Taylor out of Penn State is obviously not a good thing. Do I think that Penn State won't win any more national championships? That they won't have the same success in recruiting? I think that you're just going to lose bits and pieces of that. So where one wrestler might end. So Penn State, if they get a class of some of the top wrestlers in the country, and they've been getting 4 or 5 of them, one could end up going to Oklahoma State, for example. So it would just kind of be chipping away at what Penn State is doing in the present. A little bit of friendly fire here, because David Taylor, like I mentioned already, is an extension of Penn State. So if you take a Penn State wrestler who is, respected, glorified, everything else, right? He's very decorated in his career. You take him to Oklahoma State. It's not like he's going to continue to, it's not, Penn State's recruiting them, so I need to back off, right? I respect them as a program. No, all is fair in love and war and recruiting. And David Taylor is going to go after like-minded wrestlers. He is a like-minded wrestler to Penn State. Other like-minded wrestlers and recruits that are going to be associated with Penn State are now going to be associated with Oklahoma State if and when he would become the head coach, right? Again, this is kind of seems 50-50 at the time, depending on how this news ultimately breaks. But it's not the end of the world for Penn State. It's just you are taking one of the most iconic wrestlers in Penn State history, in Olympic, international wrestling competition history, and you're going to remove him from what, part of Penn State's structure that makes them wrestlers like David Taylor that compete or that are in or around State College, make the program that much better and allow them to be that good, that great, that elite year round.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Kale's still going to have an edge in recruiting for a long time, right?
He will. He will. Yeah.
And that's a big reason he took the Penn State job, was because, he was going to the recruiting hotbed in America for high school talent. It was just kind of a perfect storm for Penn State. And he's still the top athletes in the country. A lot of them are PA guys who are either born in PA or move to PA to better their wrestling careers, or eventually going to the college level, whether that be at Penn State or somewhere else. So Kale's definitely still going to have an edge. Obviously, David Taylor's going to attack the Pennsylvania area hard, but he's going to have to convince people to move to Oklahoma, whereas Kale, the geography doesn't really matter. That's not part of it. But it's also You look at the path of Cale and coaching. He was only 30 years old when he took the Penn State job, which is slightly younger than David Taylor is right now. And obviously, it didn't take too long for him to build this wrestling empire. Uh, Iowa under Tom Brands was perhaps on track to at least approach what they did in the Gable years, but Cale kind of stopped that from happening. I think Iowa three-peated in 2010, which was Cale's first season, and then right after that, Penn State won 4 in a row, and the rest is kind of history. But it's kind of it would be interesting. I don't want to get too far ahead. The guy hasn't taken the Oklahoma State job yet, and we can talk a lot more about it, obviously, if he does. But this David Taylor's been studying Cale, as I mentioned toward the top of the podcast. He's been studying this guy forever, and that's mainly from a technical wrestling standpoint. But you got to think he knows a lot about what Cale does well in recruiting too. So we'll kind of see if David Taylor uses that knowledge of Cale against him in recruiting, and Cale knows David Taylor pretty well too. He could kind of use that as well, and it becomes like kind of a chess match that way. But yeah, to have a guy knowing what the backgrounds are of the best coaches in college wrestling history, and knowing how savvy David Taylor is when it comes to the sport of wrestling, and knowing that he studied the guy that is the king both in wrestling history and in coaching right now. All of those combinations, along with the fact that Oklahoma State is further ahead than where Penn State was when Cale took the job. I think Penn State finished 17th at the 2009 NCAA championships, and Oklahoma State is perennially in the top 5. So that's already a well-oiled machine. And David Taylor going there, bringing dynamics that maybe weren't there when John Smith was there. That's definitely interesting, and it's concerning for the rest of the country. Maybe Penn State less so, because Penn State obviously is the king right now, but it definitely would create some uneasy feelings, I would think, around Happy Valley.
Now, would David Taylor actually succeed in Stillwater, Oklahoma? Based on what we've just talked about, Joe, yes, he would. We'll discuss that more coming up here on Locked On Nittany Lions. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Gear up for the ultimate NBA and NHL face-offs. FanDuel welcomes new customers with a golden opportunity. Right now, you can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's a whopping $150 to play on spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. So don't miss out on this exclusive offer. All you got to do is head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon, and seize your chance to turn every playoff moment into a victory. With FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, the thrill never stops. Join the winning team today and experience the excitement like never before. Elevate your game, make every shot count, and dominate the playoffs with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. I've seen the concerns that David Taylor wouldn't be the ideal head coach, that Oklahoma State is making a huge mistake here. And I just think those critics are wrong. Okay. You've already brought up the point that Cale Sanderson was a young coach, a former world-class wrestler, takes over both Iowa State and Penn State, and he improves them. And we've seen what he's done with Penn State, obviously, with a longer-term plan. David Taylor can exactly be like that. Oh, well, he doesn't have any head coaching experience. He's never run a program. He's been around Cale Sanderson. He knows all the ins and outs when it comes to coaching. All right. He is a personal trainer. So if you think, well, David Taylor can't be a head coach because he's never been a true head coach, he has been head coach like, right? He's trained Levi Haynes. He's trained other incredible wrestlers, and put that right. Levi Haynes, I'm not saying, obviously he does what he does on his own as well, but he's taken what David Taylor's taught him and become the wrestler that he is as an NCAA runner-up and then an NCAA champion in just 2 years' time. And he's going to eventually break on the scene for the Olympics and other international competitions. But I understand maybe some cultural disconnects, right? Stillwater, Oklahoma is very different than State College, Pennsylvania, and everything. But I just can't help but think, with what David Taylor knows, the work that he's going to put in, the types of wrestlers he's going to be able to recruit one way or another, even if Penn State gets the first batch, it feels like the next group would go towards Oklahoma State. I feel like David, and then all the resources and dedication, right? You said this is a top 5 program. It's hard for me to sit back and say that, I have concerns about this move from how David Taylor would do. I think he would be very successful. And you build an assistant coaching staff that would be able to bridge the gaps for anywhere else.
Yeah, and how successful David Taylor would be, at least in the eyes of Oklahoma State fans, kind of depends on your definition of success. Not too unlike what we see in Penn State football with James Franklin. Is if an Oklahoma State fan sees that David Taylor is hired and assumes that, okay, within 3 years or so, we're going to be national champs, and then after that, it's goodbye, Kale. If they're judging it based on that, they're probably setting themselves up for disappointment. But if you're a little more sensible and thinking that it's okay, we're going to be a team that's in the top 3 consistently. We're going to finish runner-up. Then on occasion, we'll get that national championship, and we're a team that's at least going to be in the mix year in, year out to unseat Penn State. If people are judging it based on that, then I think David Taylor could be very successful. And another disadvantage, I guess, he would have going to Oklahoma State, and this has nothing to do with David Taylor. Sure. It's really not too much of a knock on Oklahoma State fans either, is that, say, Cale defers within 5 years, which won't happen, but let's just say it did. And your two candidates are Jason Nolf and Jordan Burroughs. Even though JB is the more accomplished wrestler, definitely in freestyle and probably in folk style too than Jason Nolf, a lot of Penn State fans are going to want the Penn State guy. And I think that's where Oklahoma State fans would be with Coleman Scott. That's a bronze medalist and a national champion that wrestled and coached at that school, working under a guy that was a legendary wrestler and coach at Oklahoma State. So a lot of people are going to want him. And because of that, if David Taylor gets the job, he's not going to have the patience early on that Coleman Scott would, because a lot of fans are going to kind of look for reasons, maybe not to root against them because they won't want to root against Oklahoma State, but he wouldn't be given the leeway that an alum and a true cowboy, quote unquote, would at Oklahoma State. I think I have no doubt that he would be successful in the eyes of the more level-headed people, but there's going to be, as there are with any big-time program, and Oklahoma State is a big-time wrestling program, there's going to be people that expect too much too quick. And if David Taylor doesn't meet that, then I think the opinion is going to be, fair or not, the opinion is going to be skewed a little bit. So,
Joe, I think the most interesting part about all of this is, yes, David Taylor didn't seem like the premier candidate for Oklahoma State. It seemed, okay, this is interesting, but where is this going to go? And now it feels like he is their number one choice, just based on Pat Minio of the Wrestling Room's been all over this, all over the coverage, providing updates periodically. And the latest one at the time of this recording, and then when people are going to watch and listen to this episode, is that it's his decision. The job seems to be his until he declines, and he hasn't accepted or denied it. The offer is his. And then Oklahoma State couldn't wait for David Taylor to come to them. They flew out to stay college rights, so they really viewed him as the ideal candidate. So if Oklahoma State's brass is this all in on David Taylor, then yes, they think that this plan can succeed. And I agree with them. I just find it very interesting. David Taylor would be uprooting his life to take over a program. Now, he could have similar things that he has in State College, right? The farm, the family, but it's uprooting his family life, his friend life. Everything that he knows is in Pennsylvania, even though he's been well-traveled, of course, with his wrestling career. I just can't, that's hard to do, right? That's very hard to do, to pack up and move everything to Stillwater, Oklahoma, when you have little to no familiarity there. That is the only concern I would have about David Taylor making the transition to the Oklahoma State wrestling head coaching job.
Yeah, and that's where I keep mentioning the parallels between Cale Sanderson and David Taylor, but there's just so many of them, because Cale Sanderson had to do pretty much the same thing. He was leaving his alma mater, which he had taken over to coach, and there's a very good documentary. I forget who put it out, but it's basically it's a half-hour mini documentary detailing why Kale left Iowa State for Penn State. And I mentioned the recruiting was a big part of it, but it was his alma mater where he was and is not only the greatest wrestler there, but probably the greatest pound-for-pound athlete in Iowa State history, with Dan Gable obviously having a good argument for both or an athlete at that school. But everybody around Kale, his family was telling him stay at Iowa State. Friends were telling him stay at Iowa State. But he had kind of an epiphany to go to Penn State. I don't know what David Taylor's family and friends are telling him. But in any case, if he goes to Oklahoma State, he's going to be leading. I know he's not a staff member of Penn State, let alone the head coach, which is what Kale was at Iowa State, but he's still a member of NLWC and still definitely a member of the Penn State wrestling family about more than a decade after his last college match. So it would be very similar. Is David Taylor, would he have that epiphany the way Kale did, leaving Iowa State to go to Penn State? Who knows? But yeah, from Oklahoma State's end, they have an advantage in that with Coleman Scott, high school wrestlers don't remember 2012 all that well, which is when he finished bronze, but the 2021 Olympics are still fresh, and David Taylor winning that gold medal is still fresh in the minds of a lot of prospective recruits, right? So that would be a big advantage right away, and not to mention, it's Oklahoma. You alluded to it earlier, I think, but Oklahoma, oil money, name, image, likeness, they're gonna invest a lot in that wrestling program for sure. So there's definitely a lot of advantages to hiring David Taylor on Oklahoma State's end, and I think the advantage for him would be for his first head coaching job to be a perennially formidable school, which not a lot of coaches get to do. And like I said, it'd be a better situation, at least in terms of where the program is placing nationally, than it was when Cael Sanderson took over Penn State. So there's definitely benefits to both sides, I think.
Yeah, David Taylor wouldn't have to overly rebuild anything. He could start, hit the ground running immediately, especially with, like what you said, the assets that he will have at his disposal in Stillwater. Now, still to come, Carter Starachi alluding to a potential wrestling dual meet in Beaver Stadium. Penn State, if they were to do this, they would set the record for wrestling attendance at a single meet. We're going to discuss that on the other side of this break. And today's episode is also brought to you by Monopoly Go. All right, game off. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go. And I know what you're saying, flag on the play. You've already talked about that, but there's just so much good stuff in the game to tell you about. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with your friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much to get. Unique stickers you can trade with a friend to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, and hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting each and every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasure. There's always new timed events to help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win, or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench, download it now for free on Google Play or the App Store. That's Monopoly Go. Game on. If Penn State can pull this off, Joe, this is absolutely a no-brainer. Having a Penn State dual meet as opposed to the Bryce Jordan Center. You can still have them in the Bryce Jordan Center, but to have one in Beaver Stadium, the blueprints there, Iowa did it. They hold the attendance record. They had it outside of Carver Hawkeye at Kinnick Stadium, and it drew very well, over 40,000. Right, Penn State held the largest attendance record within the confines of the Bryce Jordan Center. Then Iowa said, "Okay, hold my beer. We're going to put it at a football stadium," and now this can work. The only drawback I see is the weather. Right, you have to do this at the beginning of the season. So we're basically trying to figure out how Penn State would do this, who Penn State would do this against, and if it can ultimately work. They would need to do this ASAP, right? Can you get a dual meet scheduled at the end of October? I know the wrestling season typically starts in November, but can you maybe pull some strings? If that's the case, still, what's 1 week going to make a difference for? But they would need to be first match of the season, first dual meet of the season, and you just have to pray and hope for really good weather, because what if it rains? What if it rains? And you just hope that it seems to be that the warmer weather at least sticks around in late October, early November, that it can be maybe in the 50s, 60s. It won't be temperature controlled like the Bryce Jordan Center, where it's, upper 60s, low 70s, right? But if you're able to do that, Penn State would set that attendance record. I think you'd get 50, 60,000 people. If you do it on a football weekend, I might even be lowballing it here by saying that 60,000 fans would show up to a dual meet like this. I think this would be historic if Penn State does this.
Absolutely, Zach. And there's three things I could see getting in the way of this. You mentioned the weather. You hit on that. That's pretty self-explanatory. I will say that they're starting to winterize Beaver Stadium, or winterize, or however you pronounce it. But
right.
At the blue-white game, Joel Haas from the Collegian did some digging, and there was something set up in the north end zone, I want to say, whatever end zone's opposite of where the team runs out, and he was able to confirm that they are starting the winterization process. So that could help a little bit. But by and large, the weather's could sink or help this operation. The other thing is you need to have a big-time opponent. I don't think you can have Penn State Lehigh in Beaver Stadium. Although Lehigh has they got some good individual wrestlers. Ryan Kirkham, obviously, as good as anybody in the country at 133. But the name Lehigh just isn't going to draw people. And I'm sure Penn State could get somebody good for this. I'm not too worried about that. But it's still something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you gotta plan. You have to think and plan for a big time program to come in. So that would take us some searching as well. And then the third thing, and this might actually be the biggest issue, when Iowa had their dual meet, which is kind of the blueprint for all of this. If it worked in Iowa, it could work at Penn State. But they did it on a football Saturday before a night game that Iowa's football team played Minnesota, and then Iowa wrestled Oklahoma State earlier. Penn State won't have any control of replicating that. That's up to TV. When Iowa played Minnesota in 2015, it was before NBC, CBS, and Fox had that bundle with the Big Ten. So it's a way different time period as far as that goes. Penn State, I don't think they're going to be getting a night game on the Big Ten Network the way Iowa, Minnesota was. That just isn't – this program is too big for that. So they have 3 November home games. You got Ohio State. That's probably going to be a big noon. Rule that out there. Washington maybe could be an NBC night game potentially, but that kind of seems like maybe a 3:30 type of deal. I don't know. That's a possibility, I guess. And then the last senior day against Maryland, which that could potentially work based on the fact that Penn State had a night game on NBC to end the season last year in Detroit on Black Friday, but that's also senior day, and there's a little more that goes into the pregame stuff. And it's football's house, so they'd have to sign up on it. Would football be okay with that? And for that matter, would football be okay with wrestling sharing the spotlight in general at Penn State? I don't know. So there's a lot that goes into it. I think if you don't do it on a Saturday, maybe on a Sunday after a road game, potentially that's a possibility. A Friday night would be hard because it's Pennsylvania and football runs Friday nights. That would be a little challenging. So I think if you're going to replicate what Iowa did, you got to have good weather, obviously, which you don't control, and the football schedule has to collaborate as well, and Penn State really doesn't control that either. So it's definitely worth talking about. If it can be pulled off, I think it definitely clears the 42,000 that Iowa did in 2015. So it's something that I'm definitely rooting for, but there's just so much that Penn State really has no control over that has to go right. So it's definitely interesting, and we'll know more over the summer months when Penn State's dates and times for the football schedule comes out, and see if Saturday is a possibility. But other than that, if it's not done on a Saturday, that's a little hard for me to see it working, and that's not even talking about other variables such as weather, which who knows what that's going to look like ever. So.
I mean, there would be the possibility of the bye week, right? That would make a lot of sense. I'm looking up the Penn State football schedule here just to have it in front of me.
Yeah.
And
Well,
and
I
that's
said the
why I
bye week
say,
in October, though. I don't know
yes,
if they can have
October
it.
19th would be the bye week, and that would make a lot of sense logistically. However, that's why I'm saying maybe you pull some strings and you have the wrestling season start a little bit earlier, but then you wouldn't have a conference opponent. I would want to see Penn State versus Iowa. That's who I would want the Beaver Stadium dual meet to be. And I think that especially with or Michigan, right? Michigan made a lot of moves in the transfer portal. So one of the two if it's a Big 10 opponent, but preferably Iowa, right? Because of the historical implications here. As far as an out of conference opponent, Oklahoma State, with or without David Taylor, right? Oklahoma State
Yeah.
is a viable option. Iowa State, NC State is still, I think, going to be a top 10 caliber program, despite Hayden and Trent Hidley, who are native to Pennsylvania, are moving on. Of course, I think that it's
Cornell,
going
maybe.
to
Like, go to the Ivy League to get one. Ivy League wrestling is perennially very solid.
Cornell.
Yep.
I think that really Oklahoma State and Iowa State are your only realistic options outside of conference. And then in conference, it Iowa is your top choice, but how do you get that? How are you able to get that Big Ten conference matchup that early in the season, right? This has to be in November. You can't do this. I don't even think you can do this. Like you said, okay, they play Maryland late in the season, senior day. I think that's too late. It's got to be
Yep.
the first or second week of November, or this isn't happening.
Yeah, and it just I think what might end up killing this thing is the football schedule. Because
Mm.
Sunday you're also competing against the NFL if you try to do it Sunday.
Yes.
And you can't do this and have there be like 25, 30,000 people in Beaver Stadium. It will be remembered as a failure, I think, that way.
Yeah.
It would still be cool, I guess, for the people going, but it's hard to do this unless you're absolutely sure it's going to be a smash hit. And to make
Yeah.
it a smash hit, you got to have a lot of stars aligned, which we've talked about. But yeah, I don't know if you try to get a conference opponent in. The pettiness factor of the coaches comes in. Would Tom Brands help set the record that Penn State's trying to break in Iowa? Would he want that record broken, let alone
Oh.
by his biggest rival? Who knows? We know how the Brands family can be. They like being the villain. So would they want to collaborate to help Penn State break an Iowa record? I don't know about that. I think you had an easier time getting a marquee non-conference opponent, but would the marquee non-conference opponent move the needle the way in Iowa or in Ohio State or whoever does? I'm not sure. It would be cool if Penn State played Ohio State and the wrestling team wrestled Ohio State the same day, but Big Noon is
Yeah.
gonna almost surely ruin any chance of that happening. So there's just so much, and if
Yeah.
if the TV was still how it was in 2015, I think there'd be a better chance of this working out. But
Sure.
I don't know. It's I don't feel too great about it just because of there just being so much out there that nobody really has control over.
The likelihood is definitely below 50%, but it's good in theory, right? It's great in theory. It'd be historic. That's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Nittany Lions. Go check out Joe's work over at NittanySportsNow.com. You can follow him on X for more Penn State football, men's basketball, wrestling coverage. Joe, thanks so much for the time again, as always, and can't wait to catch up in the not too distant future here.
You bet. Thanks as always, Zach.
Once again, thanks so much for checking out this episode of Locked On Nittany Lions. If you enjoyed this conversation, leave a like on the episode, share it with friends and family, join the discussion in the comments section. And if you're not already, become an everydayer, subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast for the latest conversations around your favorite Penn State sports teams. And don't forget, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus the national shows covering each and every league. You can find Locked On Sports Today now available on YouTube and the free Fire TV channels app.